As I mentioned earlier, two Chinese nationals had been arrested at the Detroit airport this week for attempting to transport potentially hazardous material into the United States. Meanwhile, President Trump's trade tariffs continue to be an issue between China, Europe, and the U.S. How are all of these developments affecting U.S.-China relations, and what of that surprise Ukrainian drone attack? Joining me to discuss all of this, author and foreign policy expert Gordon Chang. Gordon, thank you for being back on the program. The big story this week, and the one I think with chilling implications, is the one of these two Chinese nationals charged with attempting to smuggle a hazardous fungus, a possible biological pathogen, into the U.S. via the airport. These two individuals, a couple, are citizens of China and are allegedly receiving support for their research on the substance of this by the Chinese government. Some of that research done at the University of Michigan. What do you make of this arrest and these charges, Gordon?
This looks like a biological weapons attack on our farms. And we've got to put this into context, Raymond. In 2020, Americans in all 50 states received unsolicited, they received seeds unsolicited from China. I think this was an attempt to get Americans to plant invasive species in our country. This year, Temu, the online Chinese retailer, actually sent seeds unsolicited into America. So this is part of a pattern. This Detroit matter is part of a pattern to attack us. And we have to treat it that way.
And does this indicate a change in China's tactics going forward, Gordon? One that we should be more sensitive to?
China has this plan of unrestricted warfare, as they call it. So this has been going on for quite some time. But I think that the attempts at us are actually more bold now than they have been, let's say, a decade ago. So we got to be worried about the trend of events.
Tell me for a moment about the kind of damage this might have done had this substance been unleashed on the public, Gordon. What might we have seen?
This is the devastation of grains. It could have been wheat, maize, rice, barley. The United States is an agricultural superpower, and we depend on it. We feed ourselves. If we couldn't feed ourselves, we would be in jeopardy. China right now is in a situation where it is becoming less and less food self-sufficient. So they know what's at stake, and they want us to share their situation.
Yeah. Gordon, what needs to be done in response to this? I mean, I came across a story today. This goes back to November of 2023, where there was a Fresno lab that was busted, closed for illegal activities. And at the time, it was speculated that the Chinese may be using that to create bioterrorism on our own shores.
Yes, in that lab, by the official count, there were at least 20 pathogens, including the one for Ebola. I mention Ebola because at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they are now studying how to weaponize that disease, which has a natural fatality rate of 50%. The good thing about Ebola is that it's not readily transmissible human to human. But if the Chinese can figure out how to do that, then they've got a weapon to exterminate a large portion of the American population. And by the way, in that lab, they found almost 1,000 mice that had been genetically engineered to spread disease. So this was a secret Chinese biological weapons lab.
Yeah, it's amazing. And that got so little coverage. I mean, I remember when it came out, but then it quickly vanished and we moved on. But here we see the pattern. If they busted that lab and now they've got this couple coming into the United States with their own, pathogen carry-on, what's to stop them from doing something home-based? I mean, you've been covering this for years. There are Chinese agents here now who mean us harm. What should be done in regard to them? And tell me about how we should be scrutinizing everything coming into the country.
Yeah, first of all, from China, we need to inspect every container, every package, every envelope, every suitcase. But also, this is an emergency situation. The Chinese regime talks about going to war. They've identified us as their enemy. So we should no longer think of this as peacetime, which means that the measures we take need to be drastic. And that means, I think, severing most, if not all, commerce and investment, and a lot of the travel between the two countries. And I know people will think that's going too far, but we're being overwhelmed right now, Raymond, and we could lose our country.
Well, you know, we did it with Russia. We cut Russia off for a good period of time. We just didn't do business with them. They were the evil empire, and until they returned to some semblance of normalcy, you couldn't do business with them. Why is China held at arm's length and given special status? I mean, President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping are likely to speak this week after several flare-ups that have threatened a tentative trade agreement. What's happened there with this tariff tit for tat? And do you think an agreement is in the offing, or should we just stop all relations?
I think we should stop attempts to have this tariff pause and impose severe costs on China. Got to remember that May 12th agreement that we reached with China, that part of it was that China would reverse all of the non-tariff measures it had put in place after April 2nd. Liberation Day, as President Trump calls it. But China's failed to honor that promise. So I think, talking to China is just useless. And especially right now with these attacks on our farms, we should just say, look, we've had enough of this. We're going to start defending ourselves. And we have got to make sure that we protect the American people. And if that means we're going to have to sever relations with China, so be it.
Gordon, China says the U.S. is severely violating the pause, the trade truce. What do they mean? What are they talking about?
Yeah, what are they talking about? Because the U.S. has complied with its obligations under that. Now, since that May 12th agreement, both China and the U.S. have imposed additional measures on each other, but they're not part of the May 12th agreement. Clearly, we have not violated that. China's just saying that because they know they violated it. They want to throw some more crap on the wall, see if it sticks. But we should just be very clear. We have not violated the May 12th agreement.
Okay. Last weekend, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in Singapore told a global security conference hosted by the International Institute for Security Studies that the threat China poses to Taiwan is real. Watch this.
To be clear, any attempt by Communist China to conquer Taiwan by force would result in devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world. There's no reason to sugarcoat it. The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent. We hope not, but it certainly could be.
Real and imminent, yes. As we already know. I mean, China's vowed to reunify with Taiwan by force if necessary. Taiwan's government's rejecting Beijing's sovereignty claims. How soon do you think China could make a move on Taiwan?
We've got to be prepared for anything at any place at any time. And it's not just Taiwan. I think there are places where there's a higher probability of Chinese attack. So for instance, the last couple of months, there's been extremely provocative Chinese military activity against South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, and faraway Australia. And anything can happen along that periphery. So it's not just Taiwan.
Yeah, well, Hegseth also encouraged allies in the Indo-Pacific region, including Australia, to invest more in their own security. And the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, he pledged an extra $6 billion. How vital is Australia's participation in defense to that region? Or is this a case of too little too late, given what the Chinese have been doing in the South China Sea, Gordon?
Well, Australia could be very important because in the fight with China, we're going to need all of our friends and partners in the region. And Australia was important in World War II in a similar type situation. So yes, we need that base. And we also need the Australians to turf out the Chinese from their country. So this is going to be an all-of-society effort. Because we got to remember, Xi Jinping talks about going to war, and his effort is all of society because he's mobilizing civilians to go to war. He's calling up reservists, and he is taking over civilian factories so they can turn out production for the Chinese military.
June 4th marks the 36th anniversary, I can't believe it, of the Tiananmen Square massacre, Beijing's bloody crackdown on pro-democracy protesters. According to Reuters, Taiwan is the only part of the Chinese-speaking world where June 4th will be commemorated. Certainly in the United States, Britain, Australia, other Western countries, they'll mark the occasion. But Gordon, public discussion of what happened in Tiananmen Square is strictly taboo in China. Give me a sense of why this matters so much to them. They've always blamed the protests on the democracy advocates. Your thoughts on the importance of this and significance of this occasion?
This is incredibly significant. The Communist Party views it that way, which is the reason why they go to absurd lengths to prevent any discussion, any knowledge of it. What's really interesting, Raymond, is that because they've been so successful in scrubbing history of Tiananmen, a lot of Chinese people don't know about it. The reason why Deng Xiaoping killed civilians in 1989 was to teach them a lesson that the Communist Party was willing to kill to keep itself in power. A lot of Chinese people right now are not as afraid of the regime as they should be because the regime has whitewashed it. And that is also a danger to the regime. But clearly, we must keep the memory of the thousands who died that night because we have to understand the maliciousness and the evil of that regime.
Mm-hmm. China blasted the U.S. on Monday over moves it alleged harmed Chinese interests, including issuing AI chip export control guidelines and stopping the sales of chip design software to China. There's also that planned revoke of the Chinese student visas. Give me a sense of whether any of this is credible, Gordon, and what are you hearing about this situation?
Well, the Chinese regime is really upset about this, which means that we're probably doing the right thing. These measures could be more effective. We've had chip sanctions on China. We've had other sanctions on China, but we've applied them in ways where they were designed to not be effective. We gave the Chinese long notice of what we were going to do so they had time to readjust. Our sanctions weren't as comprehensive as they needed to be, and they certainly were not enforced with the vigor that was necessary. I hope that the Trump administration really gets serious about sanctions. And, with regard to the student visas, yeah, throwing out a lot of Chinese students will harm us, but we're being overwhelmed by some very dangerous elements among those students. And we know that the Chinese regime has weaponized them against us. So we have no choice. This is a matter of national survival.
Before we go, I want to get your reaction to this and the potential Chinese involvement here. On June 1st, more than 100 Ukrainian drones were launched at and struck air bases inside Russia, targeting nuclear-capable long-range bombers. According to Ukrainian President Zelensky, who directly supervised this operation, dubbed Spiderweb, 117 drones had been used in that attack. It took 1 year and 6 months to plan and execute. So, Gordon, this is being called Pearl Harbor or a Pearl Harbor moment for Russia. How serious is this attack, and how do you see this spinning out? And talk to me for a moment about China's influence vis-a-vis Russia.
China has supported the Russian war effort from the beginning. It greenlighted the invasion with that February 4th, 2022 joint statement of no limits partnership. Since then, China has been providing military intelligence, elevated commodity purchases to finance the war, opened up its financial system to sanction Russian institutions, diplomatic support, propaganda support, weapons, and Chinese soldiers are in Ukraine. They're both mercenaries, plus there's also People's Liberation Army officers in the Russian army right now, observing and learning what's going on. So China is a combatant, and unfortunately, we have refused to recognize that, and we have not imposed the sanctions on China that is absolutely necessary.
Gordon Chang, we will leave it there. For all the latest reports and analysis, you can follow Gordon at Gordon G. Chang on X. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Raymond.